Good morning, everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Digital Communications at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this on-the-record briefing session in which we'll discuss the soaring tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. Israeli strikes killed nearly 500 people yesterday in Lebanon, making it the deadliest day of conflict in the country in decades. A drastic uptick from Hezbollah and Israel's near-daily routine cross-border clashes since October 7th. Last week, an apparent Israeli attack on Hezbollah's electronic devices constituted the largest security breach in the group's history. What are the broader regional ramifications of the latest escalation? To help us understand the latest crisis in the region, I am delighted to welcome Douglas London, a 34-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's Clandestine Service and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, as well as Firas Maksad, Senior Director of Strategic Outreach and Senior Fellow at MEI. Thank you both for joining us this morning. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question. And if you're called on, we will unmute you and you can introduce yourself and direct your question to one or both of our panelists. Questions can also be submitted in writing via the Q&A chat box on Zoom. Let's get right into it. I'm going to turn to Firas first. Firas, as I mentioned in the intro, more than 558 people were killed in Israeli bombings in the last 2 days in Lebanon, over 100 of which are women and children. Fighting is ongoing. How would you assess the current situation? And do you expect Hezbollah to escalate its response to Israel's unprecedented attacks? And if so, where do you see this conflict headed?
Thank you, Zena. Good morning to you, to Doug, to all our viewers today. It's good to be with you during these ominous times and try to shed some light onto the situation. Clearly, what's transpired in the last couple of days is a very different situation than where we have been for the last 11 months. For the past 11 months, this has been largely a border conflict, sometimes a difficult one that ebbs and flows between Israel on one hand and Iranian-backed Hezbollah on the other. But today we're very much teetering on the verge of an all-out war. And obviously that's the big question that we very much are on the receiving end from friends, from family in the region, but certainly from a lot of the media out there is, has this now devolved into an all-out open conflict? I will get to answering that question, but first, perhaps let me put some fine points on what is going on. Clearly, Israel has delivered some very significant blows to Hezbollah in a way that none of us might have imagined, even those who served in the clandestine services, but I'd leave that to Doug's intervention a bit later on. The opening salvo with thousands of pagers exploding after text messages were received by members of Hezbollah in a very dramatic fashion, and we know this because Hezbollah's chief Hassan Nasrallah told us as much in his speech. Then a message from Israel delivered through intermediaries to Hezbollah's leadership, asking them to end their cross-border fire, otherwise more attacks should follow. And then obviously the walkie-talkies exploding the following day, and hundreds of airstrikes across Lebanon the day after that continue with us until today. Yesterday saw the highest death toll, as you mentioned, some 500 Lebanese killed. About 100 of them or so are believed to be women and children. And a mass exodus in Lebanon is currently taking place, not only from the south of the country, but also from the Bekaa and many areas that have been deemed unsafe, and people are trying to find places where they can hunker down for the duration of what's to come. The question as to whether we are in all-out war or not, my sense is that we're not, but we might soon find ourselves in an all-out war. What one can decipher from the brief comments made by Hezbollah's number 2 in the political leadership, Naim Qassem, Nasrallah's deputy, he said the following. He said, Jabhat al-Isnad, which is essentially the support front from Lebanon in support of Hamas in Gaza, will continue. That is the strategic objective that Hezbollah and its Iranian patrons have set out. And then we will have essentially a running tab with Israel, responding to provocations, responding to attacks that are getting deeper and striking deeper and deeper into Lebanese territory. So again, here we kind of see Hezbollah and Iran, as has been the case for the duration of this 11-month conflict, not wanting to have Israel drag them, essentially taking Bibi's bait into an all-out confrontation, an all-out war that they don't want for various reasons. We can discuss that, but also remaining adamant not to allow him or have him achieve his stated objective of actually shutting down that second front from Lebanon, thereby allowing the return of some 60,000 Israelis to their homes in the north. Which gets me to the point of sort of what is Benjamin Netanyahu's objective, stated and otherwise, from this current offensive. Obviously, the publicly stated objective is to end the rocket fire from Lebanon and to bring these 60,000 plus Israelis back to their homes. I don't think that is the real objective. In fact, Netanyahu is a veteran soldier and a shrewd politician. I think he understands very well that he will not be able to achieve that goal without going back to the diplomatic track, to a political solution that he signs on to with Hezbollah that essentially creates a new security regime for South Lebanon. And everybody, I mean, this is kind of the irony and the tragedy of Lebanon and the Middle East, that everybody has an understanding of what that would look like. UN Security Council Resolution 1701, version 2, essentially, with much strengthened enforcement mechanisms. President Biden's envoy on the matter, Amos Hochstein, who was in Israel only last week, has pretty much pre-negotiated, pre-cooked that deal. It involves Hezbollah withdrawing a certain number of kilometers from the border so that their anti-tank missiles, the Cornets, could no longer be used to attack Israeli settlements. It involves Israel either withdrawing or promising to withdraw from some key disputed points along that borderline. And then it also includes strategic monitoring and enforcement with American and French guarantees. But to unlock that deal, Iran and Hezbollah have made it conditional on a ceasefire in Gaza. And the reason why Israel and Netanyahu are unlikely to have Hezbollah and Iran back away from that prerequisite, from that conditionality, is because the entire ethos, the entire legitimacy of Iran's project in the region and Hezbollah's actions are premised on the basis that they are doing it on behalf of the Palestinian cause. And the strategy that they announced since October 7 is one of unity of fronts. And so to have Hezbollah, the most powerful tool in the Iranian kit, essentially decouple from Gaza in such a time would undermine the entire strategy, the entire rationale behind Iran's regional approach. So I think Netanyahu understands that that's a price too high to be realistically demanding of Hezbollah and Iran. And I suspect that the real objective behind this is twofold. One is to degrade Hezbollah, degrade the Iranian ring of fire around Israel, whether it's southern Lebanon, Gaza itself, Syria, Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, to deal a significant military blow to Iran's ace in the hole, which is Hezbollah in Lebanon, and degrade it. And that's kind of a situation not too different from the one that we've had in Gaza for quite some time. Obviously, there are many voices in Israel who question whether the primary objective of Netanyahu is in fact to return the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, or if it is to try and completely destroy and dismantle Hamas, essentially the Palestinian arm of that Iranian axis in the region. So I think the primary objective here is to degrade Hezbollah and the Iranian ring of fire. And I think the secondary objective here is, I think because Netanyahu understands that returning the 60,000 plus and decoupling Lebanon from Gaza is not a realistic ask, that is to try and use the pressure on Hezbollah and Iran to have them weigh in on Hamas, pressure Sinwar to give in to a more favorable ceasefire in Gaza, thereby improving the terms that have been negotiated by the administration. Whether that's realistic or not, that's an open question. I've had plenty of discussions over the last 24 to 48 hours with people who understand Palestinian Israeli dynamics better than I do. Sinwar, we know, has been itching since day one to try and broaden this conflict, improve his standing and his terms by dragging Hezbollah and Iran into this broader war. So can really Hezbollah and Iran push Sinwar to make concessions, thereby unlocking a ceasefire in Gaza and bringing a war in Lebanon to an end? It's difficult to see that at a time when Sinwar might be, in fact, encouraged by seeing the war expand to Lebanon. The Biden administration, maybe to close out, looking at all this, is looking at a Gordian knot of conditionalities between and links between Gaza and Lebanon. And through discussions I've had with senior American officials in the last couple of days, the sense is that the administration's entire approach to solving this problem, which they understand, begins with a ceasefire in Gaza that then unlocks a deal in Lebanon. That entire premise has now collapsed. And there is kind of this shared sense in the administration of a shrug, of not knowing where this goes next. And so my concern and my worry is that we will see days and weeks, if not longer, of what is a test of capabilities and a test of wills between Israel on one hand and Iran and Hezbollah on the other. And back to your original question of, will that lead to the all-out war with sort of no ceilings, no limits, no red lines, and utter destruction? There's a good chance of that happening because the diplomatic track at this point is almost completely blocked, and we're watching things play out militarily on the Lebanese arena.
Thank you, Firas. Doug, yesterday the Israelis dropped 1,600 bombs on Hezbollah targets. That follows the Patriot attacks last week. The Israelis are mounting an extremely aggressive campaign against the group. What do you think they're hoping to achieve with this massive use of power? And in your view, what are the risks of this campaign?
Well, thanks, Zaina. It's great to be with you in the audience today, and it's a privilege to be talking with Firas. I think if listeners are expecting to see a lot of daylight between Firas and me, they probably won't see it because I think we seem to be fairly well aligned. You know, the challenge in this region, and everybody likes to use buzzwords, oh, it's volatile, it's unpredictable, is that we generally look at key assumptions that help guide what are the miscalculations that could bring us to a major, we're at a major conflict, but an all-out war. I think using even the terms all-out war have lost some of its validity. I mean, it's pretty violent out there, and there's tremendous casualties and damage being done. And in terms of rules, you know, I've read many times, oh, you know, the Israelis are breaking the rules. You know, in general, rules are what you're going to be able to get away with. Rules are what you can do without significant consequences that restrain you. When it comes to international relations, particularly, you know, affairs between adversaries, it's not like they sit down and drop, okay, here's what we're not going to tell people, but what we're going to do, and you can do this and I can do that. That's just not the way it works in reality. Challenging our key assumptions is key right now, because if we go into this thinking, oh, nobody wants an all-out war, you know, everybody wants to resolve this, they want to get back to life as relatively normal as possible, I think that's a mistake. And I think Firas is making this point, particularly when it comes to one of the belligerents in this conflict, which is Israel, and certainly Hamas and Sinwar. There's little to no motivation on the part of Netanyahu and Israel, nor Sinwar, to find a peaceful settlement. This serves their interests politically, their own personal political ambitions. Netanyahu, we keep hearing and seeing about, well, that reckoning is going to come for October 7th, and his political reckoning is going to come. Well, it's not going to come while they're at war. So Netanyahu has a personal, professional interest in perpetuating the conflict to preserve his position and keep the far right parties on his side and keep them fed and keep them happy. Netanyahu, yeah, he's been around forever. He's been through all these conflicts. He's been through the 2006 war. He knows his adversaries, and these adversaries know him. So we're not talking now about this risk of a giant miscalculation that leads to this or leads to that. I think right now you see a very deliberate approach by the three main parties here in the region, Lebanese Hezbollah, Israel, and Hamas, and then Iran, you know, back in the rear on the sidelines somewhat. You know, Nasrallah has gambled. and in collaboration with Iran to stake their credibility and reputation on taking up the Palestinian cause, on initiating hostilities with Israel right after October 7th. I think it started as soon as October 8th. And that was a gamble based on his calculation that Netanyahu didn't want an all-out war. I think he might come to regret that. And likewise, we've seen the Iranians being a lot more cautious. When was the last time we've seen an attack on a U.S. air base or members or such like that? When we've seen more provocative actions from Iran in retaliation for Haniya's assassination. Firas made the point that Hezbollah and the Iranians are trying to be careful not to take up the bait that Netanyahu is putting down, but there's limits as well to what they can do. Hezbollah has to contend with its constituency, contend with a very complex and difficult political dynamic in Lebanon amongst the Sunnis, the Shias, the Christians, and how they divide power. And to an extent, those parties at the very senior levels, they get along because it's in their interest to get along. Because I've had questions, well, if Israel invades and there's an incursion, will they be able to count on Christian militias? I'm skeptical about that because they've got too much to lose. And one of the well, maybe witting consequences of what Israel has achieved by this very heavy escalation is they've actually helped Hezbollah create more sympathy among the broader Lebanese community for the attacks because of the civilian casualties, because of the tactics Israel has been using. So in trying to predict what's going to happen, it's hard to look at what we, particularly on the outside, think is logical. Oh, it doesn't make sense for Israel to begin a ground invasion. I mean, think about the political price they pay with the casualties that they suffered in 2006, and it probably could be a lot more. And we look at Hezbollah actually in action, showing somewhat more restraint by not using a lot of their inventory of missiles that could strike anywhere in Israel. I mean, maybe the Israelis can interdict and intercept a fair number of them, but they're now equipped, as opposed to 2006, with long-range ballistic, I mean, short range by our standards, but ballistic missiles that could strike 200, 300 kilometers. And basically, it's not just a buffer zone. So Israel talks a lot about restoring deterrence, right? And trying to maybe double down by forcing Hezbollah to cease its attacks, but they really can't, and Israel knows that. But at the same point, how far Israel wants to push, because Netanyahu has to watch that very fine line between being aggressive, being decisive, and to Firas's point, I believe inflicting as much damage as he can get away with. He sees an area of opportunity. He sees what he believes is a free hand to inflict significant damage on Hezbollah and send a message to Lebanon and not necessarily pay a price. And then just to, and I want to be able to get to the Q&A, to get back to where the U.S. is, this is not America's war. With all the damage being done to Hezbollah, which, I spent much of my career chasing Hezbollah and chasing Mughniya and Badruddin, Talal Hamid is still out there, but Ibrahim Akil is dead, Fouad Shukra, all household names to the CIA that we've been chasing for their role in the 83 bombings and against our embassy, against the Marine barracks, and kidnappings and airplane hijackings and what have you. But the cost in terms of perpetual conflict, Israel doesn't have an embassy in Iraq, the United States does. Israel doesn't have an embassy in Lebanon, we do. And the Iranians have very often decided, well, it's easier to strike the United States because it's less likely they're going to retaliate in a massive fashion, or probably be proportional, or probably be discriminant. So we could go ahead and do that and claim we're striking Israel. And it's not like the Israelis are choreographing any of this for us. It's not like the Israelis are giving us advance notification and telling us or seeking our permission. So the United States finds itself, particularly with 43 days to election, in a very challenging time to exercise influence, very limited influence on Israel, and less credibility with the other players in the region on the Arab side in terms of what we could do to bring this conflict to at least a peaceful timeout, if not end. So I think it's really challenging to predict because a lot of the norms are out the window. A lot of the key assumptions have to be challenged that really aren't valid anymore. And in trying to predict what players are going to do, I think you have to kind of go to what is in Nasrallah's best political interest to survive, Netanyahu's interest, and Yahya Sinwar's, and that might be a lot more revealing about what we can expect in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you, Doug. At this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to callers on the line. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom or submit your question in writing via the Q&A chat box. To start things off, I'll pose a question to Firas. Firas, sort of to dovetail into Doug's answer, we keep hearing that neither Hezbollah nor Iran want to escalate, yet Israel seems to be giving them little choice, given what seems to be its goal to weaken Hezbollah significantly. What are the risks for Hezbollah and Iran if Hezbollah decides to unleash its full stockpile of weapons on civilian centers in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that great question. And that's actually where you might find some daylight between me and Doug. So this will get fun. Listen, I think Hezbollah's Achilles heels is its basic support within the Lebanese community, primarily within the Shia community in Lebanon, and kind of the immediate circle of families around its fighters and senior members. And I think this time around, just sort of watching how the events so far have unfolded, Israel seems to be more attentive to bringing pressure, political pressure, public pressure onto Nasrallah by trying to put a wedge between him and that key constituency that he has to be mindful of. We all remember that after the 2006 war, a disastrous month-long war that brought utter devastation to South Lebanon, parts of South Beirut and the Bekaa, that Nasrallah very famously in a candid moment said on TV, had I known the consequences, I would have not undertaken this war, and essentially ordered the kidnapping, the killing and kidnapping of Israeli soldiers in a cross-border operation. A moment of public regret there for Nasrallah. Of course, back then, Lebanon had the advantage of having ties to the Arab Gulf, the sort of deep-pocketed countries in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and others, and got billions of dollars in reconstruction aid. We all know the geopolitics of the Gulf today are completely different, that does not exist. And so there is a lot of anxiety and anticipation within the Shia community and Hezbollah support base more broadly as to whether this will be a repeat of the 2006 war or even worse. They do not want it. Everybody has been watching for the better part of a year the utter devastation visited on Gaza and the Palestinians. Nobody, despite sort of public proclamations of willing to sacrifice for Nasrallah or for the cause, nobody wants to see that visited upon their homes and villages for the sake of the Palestinians in Gaza or for the sake of Hamas. So through the walkie-talkie operation, highly sophisticated and targeted, despite obviously civilian casualties too, and the pager operation, targeting that community, that immediate circle of members and supporters of Hezbollah, I think Israel is trying to create that wedge. Others in Lebanon, this is kind of where Doug sort of referenced maybe the Christians, the Druze and the Sunnis, others, there are mixed emotions as to what's going on. By and large, overwhelmingly, everybody you speak to did not from day one want to see Lebanon involved in this war. I mean, Hezbollah is perceived as dragging Lebanon into a conflict that is not its own. Let's not forget, this is a country that's still reeling from a disastrous 2019 economic collapse and the 2020 port explosion. So there's very little appetite. But there's also sort of this, as Doug pointed out, this cross-current of human sympathy. They see the refugees, thousands and thousands streaming out of the south, of the Bekaa, looking for places of shelter. And so what you're seeing playing out is kind of this mix of, well, Hezbollah and its supporters are what got Lebanon to the disaster that it's in today, but also the human element of wanting to come together as Lebanese. And I think here, again, Israel and Netanyahu, depending on how they carry out this campaign, might be looking to play on these differences and create that wedge of between Hezbollah and its support base. I very quickly would say that I heard statements from Israel's education minister and other senior officials in Israel saying that Lebanon is Hezbollah and all of it needs to pay the price and Lebanon should be annihilated. Maybe then there is no better way than rallying all the Lebanese behind Hezbollah than lumping them together, which is different from the reality of what exists today.
Absolutely. We have so many questions. We will try to get through as many of them as we can. Let's start with a few questions from Mike Brest from the Washington Examiner. We answered the first one in the opening remarks. So let's go to the second one. How does Hezbollah's capabilities compare to Hamas's and Iran's other proxies? And Mike also wants to hear what you believe the consequences of an all-out war could look like for both sides and the region. Doug, you want to take that one?
Wow, okay. Thanks. So capabilities are we looking at first? Hezbollah's capabilities. So Hezbollah is a very professional organization despite recent appearances, and they're a credible foe, both in terms of being a military force, they're very professional, and as an intelligence service and a counterintelligence service. Since 2006, they continue to expand their arsenal with weapons that are far more sophisticated. They now have a very sophisticated Iranian anti-tank weapon, which is actually a copycat of an Israeli weapon that they seized during 2006. They have missiles that are of Iranian design, but some of them are actually produced by Syria that have extended ranges. They also own the territory. They own the turf within Lebanon. So in terms of dealing with an Israeli ground incursion, as they did pretty effectively in 2006, they could probably do even more effectively today, all these years later. But, the difference is militarily when we look at, well, what is Israel trying to achieve, thus to try to understand what they might do. Do they want to establish a buffer zone? Lebanon is a place where now Hezbollah could operate from throughout the country and strike Israel, at least with its longer range missiles. What a buffer zone would get would limit cross-border commando operations and the kidnappings and the killings and such, which the Israelis might find worthwhile, but will it be worth the cost? So I think today, in terms of the capabilities, in an all-out war, as we keep using that expression, which I just detest, Hezbollah is not going to win, but they're not going to lose. And what do we define winning? Does winning mean they need to beat back the Israeli forces, or do they need to inflict tremendous casualties, survive, and rally Lebanon together to their side at a point where politically they've been having problems? The economy of Lebanon, I mean, Hezbollah is just as responsible for all of that, and particularly the young people in Lebanon who go out there and protest and criticize. They lump Hezbollah into it. So to Firas's point, the political issues are significant. But I think Israel is making some, just based on my experience in the region, questionable choices if they really think their tactics will create the wedge. Besides the problematic announcements by the Israeli education minister, attacks like they've conducted in Dahiya, going after an entire building to go after one or two particular military targets, the use of pagers, which, people who carry pagers and walkie-talkies, they put them down in their kitchens, their living rooms. I mean, the Israelis knew there were going to be civilian casualties, which is why those are operations that we would not legally conduct because of the indiscriminate nature and an inability for us to control casualty collateral, though I know a lot of people are winging and eyeing. It's really sophisticated. But, as a spy, and that's what I am at the end of the day, I would have actually used those GPSs on the pagers and the radios to collect and map out Hezbollah, to map out their locations, all their missile sites, to get patterns of who's together, how many numbers of pagers are in the same places, where they go, their movements, collect audio. The Israelis chose instead to use them kinetically, which, that was a choice. It's not inconceivable. They collected some intel, but by virtue of their actions, I think they intended from the outset for it to be kinetic. So I don't necessarily know that Israel's tactics are going to achieve, and I don't think they really believe it would achieve, sympathy for them, God knows, and more angst and more separation of support for Hezbollah. I forgot what the second part of the question was, Zaina. I'm sorry.
Let me pull it out. The second part is Mike wants to hear what you believe the consequences of an all-out war could look like for both sides and the region.
Well, I think Israel would probably suffer a bloodletting in terms of casualties, and Lebanon would suffer catastrophic damage across the country to its infrastructure. And to Firas's point, it's not 2006. I don't see a bailout, and a bailout doesn't bring back human life. And I think the casualties would just be horrific for a country that's already gone through so much. I think it's a wild card, but one thing I speak to is, we seem to have this faith in Lebanon because its society has prevailed through so much and thrown so much chaos and warfare and such like that, that, apart from Hezbollah, it's not really radicalized, right? It's not become an Afghanistan. It's not become a Somalia. There's been a great deal of flight of people from Lebanon. There's been a great deal, particularly of, the working folks, the middle class, certainly capital flight and such like that. I don't think it's inconceivable if that country is leveled to the extent that the Israelis could do if they choose to, beyond 2006, that it becomes a more radical society where it's not just Hezbollah, but it's also maybe ISIS, is where it's maybe also other groups that start fringing up across the Sunni, the Druze, the Christian, the Shia communities that pose a greater danger for the region and certainly the world. And I think Israel no longer could sort of be comfortable that, well, Hezbollah could only hit so far into Israel. I've seen the video clips and I see the very, the significant spin on Israeli spokesman for what's been hit and what's not. Hezbollah could do a lot more damage. And if Iran sort of green lights a full-scale Hezbollah war, then what stops them from saying, okay, now we're going to retaliate for Hania. Now we're going to go ahead and live up to what we've said is our main cause, which I don't think is their main cause, the Palestinian people. The Iranians are more concerned about Iranians rising up against them, but they may not have any other choice, and it might be an opportune time to do it, an opportunity they passed up at the outset after October 7th, but now they may have that opportunity to come back again.
All right.
Dana, can I chime in here very quickly to add to some of Doug's excellent points? I just want to very quickly also address the possibility of contagion, of this drawing in others in the region, particularly Iran. That's a question that's come up time and again, and the Iranians have certainly threatened publicly that should Hezbollah be on its back foot, and should Israel in fact try to utterly destroy and dismantle the organization, that it would get directly involved in this. After all, Hezbollah is Iran's most powerful asset outside of its borders. Its force projection capability on the Mediterranean, on Israel's northern border, spent billions of dollars over the course of 40 years to build the organization, and very much the benefit of Hezbollah has become exponential since the Arab uprisings of 2011, because Hezbollah now is helping build Iranian proxies and militias throughout the region, in Yemen and in Iraq and in Syria and other places. So the question is whether Iran will get directly involved. I think kind of what I heard Doug say, and I want to kind of underscore that, is that I significantly doubt it, particularly given the deterrence, the naval assets and military assets that the Biden administration has chosen to deploy in a non-subtle message to the Iranian regime that should it get directly involved, it will find itself in a war with the United States. What I do think is a higher possibility is that we see the various Iranian militias in the region, from Syria, from Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, perhaps get engaged in this, and in an attempt to get to come to Hezbollah's aid. We're not there yet, but if there is contagion, I keep getting that question about Iran's direct involvement. Less likely, but more likely that we'll see militias in these various countries getting themselves involved.
Speaking of Iran's involvement, I'm going to go to a question from Joe Jaja, and then we can go to a question from John de Blasio. Joe wants to know, the new Iranian president in his recent interview on CNN sounded very conciliatory to the West. The recent rhetoric from Tehran, and for that matter, Syria, has been very muted since Israel launched its aggressive actions in Lebanon. Is this the early sign that Tehran may have sold Hezbollah down the river in recognition that Israel is far superior militarily? Firas, do you want to start that question? Then we'll see if Doug would like to add to it.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for that difficult one. Listen, the comments, and again, let me preface this by saying I'm no expert on domestic Iranian politics, but the comments being made by the Iranian president have certainly raised eyebrows within the quote unquote axis of resistance. Let's remember that this is primarily a Persian, predominantly Shia power that has become prevalent through its proxies in a predominantly Arab Sunni lands. And so there's built-in tensions and sensitivities there. And again, part of to my point, which is why the Palestinian cause is so essential for Iran's the legitimacy of Iran's axis and proxies and actions throughout the region. But for Iran, the Iranian president to come out at a time when hundreds of Lebanese, I mean, 500 was the death toll just yesterday from Israeli strikes in Lebanon. Gaza has been devastated and destroyed, some 40,000 plus Palestinians died. And for the Iranian president to come out in such a situation and say that the Americans are our brethren in humanity, so to speak, and that they seek peace and their hands are extended, that struck the wrong tone and struck a nerve with many of Iran's allies and proxies in Arab lands, and certainly with a lot of Lebanese. And so I am uncertain as to what's happening within kind of the Iranian body politics and whether these kind of are off the cuff remarks that hadn't been planned, but they are part of, I think we can understand them as being this sort of broader sense in Tehran that they don't want to get directly involved. It's coming down in all the wrong ways for their allies and proxies in the various Arab countries.
Doug, would you like to add to Firas's answer?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. You know, Pezeshkian is the president because the supreme leader wants him to be. And he chosen deliberately to serve a purpose, to be a way to vent, to be a way to kind of have an alternative set of sound bites and such like that. He has no power. He exercises certainly no power when it comes to international security and international relations. And it's the supreme leader who's the commander in chief. So, I mean, you got to look more at Iranian actions than words, but the words are still interesting. And to Firas's point, I'm certainly they stirred up some concern among some of Iran's proxies and partners, but not really among the people who make differences and make the decisions. Iran deals with its proxies primarily through the IRGC. That's their gateway back to the supreme leader. I don't see any potential of Iran, you know, selling out Hezbollah. They depend on Hezbollah as a deterrence. It is the fact that, which Firas speaks very well, that Iran does not want to see Hezbollah chewed up and lose its deterrent value against Israel to mitigate against Israeli attacks, you know, direct military attacks and those of the United States. So I think it's important to, you know, you listen to what the Iranian president says, because it's interesting that he's permitted to say these things. And there is an agenda. There's certainly an agenda on the part of the supreme leader to manipulate that. He's dealing with his succession issues. He's dealing with probably the most difficult economic and political times that he has faced during his rule at a time when he is of at least deteriorating health. So I think he's been very deliberate in when and how to use Pezeshkian, who I think is completely his puppet that he uses to just do what he wants, to allow him some wiggle room, because I think he has to consider how he's going to lift some of these sanctions, how you know, how far he can go before he needs to address some of the pressing economic and political issues. But that doesn't preempt the Iranians from standing by Hezbollah, launching some direct attacks with drones and missiles, maybe at some point if they so choose, stirring the pot as they would. But we've also seen, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's been less Houthi missile attacks. There's been less attacks against U.S. forces in the region. So it's important to connect some of those dots in terms of indicators and what it means, but it also shouldn't be mistaken as, okay, the Iranians want peace, the Iranians going to abandon Hezbollah, because that's not going to happen.
All right. We're going to go to John de Blasio right now. John, you are unmuted. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. My question is about the alignment of interest between the United States and Israel with respect to this action in the north, and whether or not there is any gap between the two in the context of the desired outcomes and ends of this effort. I think, Firas, you brought a point of question as to the potential that this could lead to a degradation of Hezbollah's position in Lebanese politics, such to the point that it could reform the Lebanese political dynamic. And I think Doug's a little bit questioning on that potential. But I see that as again, Doug, you love the hopeful aspect of Lebanon as a potential outcome that the U.S. would like to see. But do the Israelis share that same desired outcome? Do we have complete or some misalignment here, as in the Gaza situation?
Doug,
I'm going to jump in first, and then Doug too, if you want to.
Okay, I do, but go ahead.
Yeah, John, there's significant daylight between the administration and Netanyahu on this. And in fact, just before Amos Hochstein, the presidential envoy on this file, went to Israel a week ago, 10 days ago now. I saw him in a private audience in a discussion. And I could tell you that it couldn't be any clearer how much daylight there was. The administration just does not want a broader conflict in the Middle East right now. It's in the entire thrust of its strategy from day one is to bring Gaza to a diplomatic outcome rather than to see the war expand to Lebanon. And this obviously also ties into their domestic calculus here in terms of an election year that is contested and close. So Amos Hochstein time and again making the case that that there is no military pathway to ending the rocket fire from southern Lebanon into northern Israel, and then essentially it would have to be unlocked through a ceasefire in Gaza. And I think the Israeli view is that we've waited some 11 months now for you to try and unlock a diplomatic outcome in Lebanon. And how much longer do you need? Clearly, you've been unable to attain that. And so very much daylight there. I would say that said, President Biden remains committed to Israel's security and to deterring Iran. That might be for various reasons, including his own ideological beliefs, and maybe perhaps a readiness, a reluctance by the administration to exercise political will, a lack of political will during an election year to be seen as pressuring Netanyahu or pressuring Israel one way or the other. Netanyahu, obviously, I think there's no Israeli politician that understands American politics, that knows how to read the tea leaves in Washington better than he did. He was recently here. He got several standing ovations in Congress. And I think sort of what he walked away with is that we're essentially in a lame duck period in the United States, an election period. Not until there's a sort of new administration sworn in on January 20th will there be any kind of significant pressure brought on him to bring Gaza and now Lebanon to a close. So I think that there is daylight, but at the end of the day, Netanyahu's reading is that it won't amount to much.
Doug?
Yeah, so there's so much daylight that there's no pair of Ray-Bans that could kind of protect you from the sun, right? So as a CIA officer, I've worked in this region most of my career, and I've worked in most of these countries and with most of the folks involved, including American adversaries, because one of the interesting features of the CIA's experience in the Middle East is we've actually had some degree of credibility with friends and enemies alike, because generally we've been non-political, we've been clinical, and we've delivered on our word, whether it was good or bad. War is simply not in America's interest, and that has been what Bill Burns, the current CIA director, has been trying to say to all parties. It's not in their interest, is what the point he's been making, though that's fallen on deaf ears in Israel, and certainly with Yahya Sinwar in Gaza, because it is in their interest right now to have this war. But for the US, we are, again, we can't decouple ourselves from what Israel is doing in terms of the region. And it is undermining not just the stability, which could create the contagion to which Firas speaks, that could make this not just a regional war, but a far broader war, which even the superpowers get involved to one degree or another. And I'm speaking specifically of Russia and China, whether it's economic, whether it's supplying arms, intelligence, or using it as a proxy battle itself. So the last thing we want is for a perpetuation of hostilities. And it doesn't matter how many really significant Hezbollah leaders are killed, though, as Jake Sullivan said, those are positive developments. It's not worth the damage and the price that the United States is going to sustain. But Amos Hochstein, who had been fairly effective, and similarly, because he's had good relationships among all parties, he's used Mr. Nabi Berri as a conduit to Hezbollah. He drew some credibility with them in terms of what he could deliver. I mean, that's been lost, I believe. It's very clear the U.S. can deliver nothing. The U.S. can exert no pressure on Netanyahu. And the world then looks at us because, you know, we speak a lot about human rights, and we have the Leahy Act, which the CIA has to subscribe to as well, which means you can't provide, you know, training, military equipment, intelligence to governments or non-state actors who are violating human rights, who are, you know, committing war crimes and whatever. And, you know, it puts us in an awkward position to look at some of the Arab states where we've had some issues with their human rights records, justifiably so, to suggest, well, we have to limit the scope of our cooperation. And, you know, you have Israel with some of these tactics that they've employed, and yet I have not even heard, except from the media, any discussion that the Leahy Act would be invoked, limiting what the U.S. could do. So that gap is very significant. And as I said earlier, we have a commitment to support Israel's security, but the way they're fighting this war is not America's war in terms of our interests, our national security requirements. It's becoming more dangerous for the United States the longer this violence rages out of control.
Let's stay with you, Doug. We have a question. Thinking about the larger backdrop, what if Sinwar is dead? Who will be in a position to negotiate with the Israelis on behalf of Hamas and actually have the ability to control boots on the ground? Even if Sinwar is alive, is he still in a position to control actions in Gaza?
If Sinwar is alive, he's still very much in a position to control actions in Gaza. And Hamas has done a very good job, relatively, of decentralizing, delegating their management. It makes them slower, but they have a lot of standing orders. They are using a lot of old school communication techniques, which predate digital. Some other techniques that I can't really speak to because they're challenging to interdict, but they're using that. So I know there's been some discussion. Oh, we haven't heard from Sinwar. Maybe he's dead. Yeah, maybe. But if Sinwar goes, it's not like he's going to be replaced by some progressive who all of a sudden, oh, you know, for the sake of the Palestinian people, we're just going to stop the fighting and call it a day, and we're going to accede to Israeli demands and such. I just don't see that happening. Both those parties were offered pretty good terms, just from what we've seen in the open press, in terms of what Hamas was basically offered survival, political survival, where they would maintain a degree of influence. And Israel was offered tremendous concessions as well that you think would secure their, help guarantee their security and allow them more of a role in Gaza than, you know, even Hamas would have. But they both passed on that because it's not in their interest. And I don't really see at this point anyone stepping up. The issue is, are we at a point where Israel in the form of Netanyahu and Hamas in Sinwar believe there is a military solution? And the military solution doesn't necessarily mean to be a total victory of occupation or the annihilation of Israel, what have you, but a military solution nonetheless that serves their political interests. I keep coming back to that because I keep seeing the actions driven by the political interests of the parties. And to this point, the relative restraint, and it's hard for me to say it with straight face because I spent a lot of my professional career chasing down and hunting Hezbollah leaders, that Hezbollah, because they're caught between a rock and a hard place, is showing some restraint. And I think it will be political pressure that Israel is trying to help facilitate that might provoke them to further escalate, even at the expense of giving Netanyahu even a greener light to inflict more devastation on Lebanon.
All right, Firas, we'll go to you for this one. It's from Catherine Scher. I believe she's with DW. Apologies if I'm mistaken. she wants to know that you say the US is shrugging in terms of other players. What would be the red lines for other Arab nations to come to Lebanon's support, not militarily, but perhaps willing to use diplomatic levers, something that would make them take a harder line in this widening conflict? For example, curtail trade with Israel, make Israel's life more difficult with embargoes, restrict US military movements in their countries. Would a ground incursion into Lebanon make a difference, for instance? Or will countries like the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt continue to look on if it's not their own national interest directly threatened?
Yeah, the most direct answer to that is no. I don't think that any of these Arab countries are going to readjust and revisit their strategic calculus based on what might transpire in Lebanon in the coming days and weeks. We have to understand, and for those of us who travel there quite often and talk to officials, particularly from the Gulf, is that their threat perception, their primary threat perception, does not come from Israel. Israel's actions with Palestinians in Gaza and Lebanese in Lebanon certainly makes things more difficult for them in terms of managing domestic public opinion. Now, some of these countries are rather small with small native populations, and so public opinion can be managed. Some of them are larger. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia in particular here, where it becomes more difficult, and they have to perhaps revisit the tone of their public statements. But the underlying premise here, the underlying threat perception, continues to be Iran, and what happens in Lebanon and Gaza is not going to change that. To put a finer point on it, a human element perhaps, one of these discussions on the many visits to the region had somebody tell me, it's like, we have never been attacked by Israel. These Gulf countries in particular are not confrontation states. They have been attacked directly and indirectly through militias and drones and rockets that are made in Iran. So at the end of the day, the hard geopolitical calculus of most of these countries, particularly the rich countries that in the past have come to Lebanon's and even Palestinian aid, is not going to change because of what's likely to unfold in Lebanon. Perhaps the public discourse, the public tone might, but I wouldn't at all be surprised that after this comes to a conclusion, years down the line, the general sort of direction of movement will continue to be that of normalization between Israel and the Gulf.
All right. Doug, I'm going to go to you for this question, and then we'll see if Firas would like to add to it. It's from Yossi Nasser. Yossi says, there have been some talk within Israel of potentially looking at targeting and eliminating Nasrallah himself this time around. Given his symbolic importance to Hezbollah, it seems they have the capability to do it. What's Israel's interest in keeping Nasrallah alive? If they're able to eliminate him this time around, what will Hezbollah look like? And what will their place be within Lebanon, the region, and as an asset to Iran?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. I'm just going to real quickly touch on and pretty much compliment what Firas said about the Gulf states and the other Arab countries in the region. They're more threatened by Muslim Brotherhood than they are by anybody else. And Muslim Brotherhood is basically an extension of Hamas for them. So there's not much sympathy. I think they're just more responsive to their own political sentiment towards the Palestinians and will say rhetoric, but not really change course. So I'm pretty much online with that. Again, the Gulf states have been attacked by Hezbollah. Yasser Arafat abandoned Kuwait when Iraq invaded it. They've got long memories. So in terms of friends and enemies and whatever, I think they're going to stay consistent. In terms of Nasrallah, it's a good question because it's hard to say depending on the objective. One could suggest that the Israelis really understand Nasrallah. Nasrallah tends to be predictable. He doesn't tend to be terribly impulsive. They kind of understand what he may or may not do. And, could they go after him? I have no doubt that they're always hunting him. I have no doubt they're always looking for an opportunity to strike him. Whether or not they pull the trigger, I think at the end of the day, if they had an opportunity, they would. But I don't think it's as necessary for them to go after Nasrallah, who's a political leader, and in a sense, in terms of what his gravitas is with the Lebanese community and Hezbollah leadership, it's replaceable, right? It would be a setback, but I don't think necessarily catastrophic. And we might see even more radical leader come to succeed him. So I think the Israelis would take a shot if it was like handed to them on a silver platter. But I think they're much more focused on what they consider military targets, military leaders, people that they have some grudges against, particularly. And a lot of the folks that we've seen them, eliminate have been people that they've got long grudges against. So that would be my expectation. I don't think we'd see any significant transformation. Nasrallah eventually will move on at some point in life, right? And he will be replaced by somebody. And at this point, in the midst of chaos, the good money would be his successor would be even more unpredictable, even more radical, and probably more beholden even to Iran. And some of what has guided Nasrallah, as opposed to the days of Imad Mughniya and the days of Mustafa Badruddin, is he's much more beholden to Iran. And he's made Hezbollah a much more bureaucratic organization, which is a little bit less dynamic and agile and not very willing to strain against Iranian direction. A successor maybe be more beholden to Iran. That would be my first inclination because they propel him. But at the same point, I spoke to how Lebanon could be becoming more radicalized. And there's your wild card of somebody who's even more difficult and more dangerous for us all.
All right. Firas, would you like to add to Doug's answer?
I'll just say very briefly, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. I think that's the Israeli thinking. And I don't like to dabble in whispers, but credible sources early on in this conflict had it that Israel, in fact, was able to take a shot at Nasrallah, but that folks in this town and the White House in particular did not want to see that happen because of, again, the Pandora's box that might open. We've essentially seen since then, particularly in the last week or so, that Israel has basically cut Nasrallah's legs from underneath him by taking out the entire military command, absent one or two, beneath him. A significant number of the Jihadi Council, Hezbollah's chief of staff, Hezbollah's head of special operations. So these are powerful blows that significantly undermines Nasrallah's ability to conduct warfare, but have, for now, not taken the shot at him. And although I have to say, and I think that's maybe where the question is coming from, Netanyahu has sort of very clearly alluded now on a number of occasions since this uptick began last week that they have taken out the top military echelons and that more can be in store. And I think this was a not too subtle hint at that Nasrallah himself might be in jeopardy.
All right, which brings us to the last two questions. What are the triggers for Hezbollah and Iran to drop their restraint and escalate against Israel? And are they in a position to do this after the blows they received in the past 2 weeks? Doug, you want to start with that one?
That's really a great question because it's incredibly hard to answer. Because I believe the triggers would be political forces internal to which they have no choice but to respond. The Israelis have pretty much eviscerated Hezbollah in a lot of ways and made them look feeble, look incompetent, strike at their membership, strike at their families and such. So I think we've already blown past a lot of those triggers. I think what we'll see is this continuing escalation where the Israelis will keep pushing and provoking and Hezbollah trying to find that fine line. You see the care they're taking in messaging. All the rockets that they fired recently, they've been very careful to announce these are military targets. These are military targets. They're very cautious and very careful. I think they're trying to avoid, pushing Israel even further than it's already going. And I don't really think they could slow them down. And I also don't think, and just one thing to Firas's point, I don't think the U.S. can tell Israel anything at this point. I am very confident we told them not to do a whole lot of things they've already done. So I don't think us telling them, oh, don't kill Nasrallah would make absolutely any difference on this government. But triggers for Hezbollah, for Iran, you know, Iran has always acted when it feels it needs to restore its own image at home, that it looks weak at home because it's worried about its own political fractures and centralization. I think the same issue would be with Hezbollah. If Hezbollah saw some action, attack, something that undermined their credibility, their legitimacy, that could provoke the, you know, fracturing of their base, that would prompt them, such as pressures to do something for revenge against all the attacks that have been conducted so far.
All right. Firas, how do you see the internal political dynamics inside Israel, and under what conditions would the dam burst on the political status quo?
Very difficult question for a Lebanese American like myself to answer. I'm always very careful to say that I've never been to Israel. I'm precluded from visiting, or at least if I do, I will not be able to go back to Lebanon. And so I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, and I'm going to pass on that question.
Doug, would you like to take it?
Sure, as I scramble to press my unmute button. Yeah, Israeli politics are funny. Israel, a democracy, a pretty chaotic one of sorts, and it's been that chaos which has helped Netanyahu survive. We've seen massive protests and demonstrations trying to take Netanyahu down. We've seen the protests prior to that over the reshaping of the judiciary that Netanyahu was trying to shape, which actually did have an influence and did have some impact. So I think the volatility is a factor. I think that Netanyahu right now is very much consolidating his relationship with the far right that has brought him power and keeps him in power, while trying to deflect a political reckoning by preventing any ceasefire, any peace and such like that. I think the hostages have been a tremendously sensitive issue, and yet even that hasn't made the difference, because clearly the hostages have not been Netanyahu's priority in terms of the military actions. And, you know, the hopes now are getting, you know, more scant and stretched and stuff like that. But I would not rule out a political movement forcing Netanyahu's hand. I would not rule out what could occur. And it's always really hard, particularly as an intel officer, as a spy. You know, we get great secrets when we have penetrations of defense ministry, of an intelligence service. But to pulse a people is very hard to do. And to try to determine what is that emotional red line. You know, polls and samplings only get so far. Who knew that, you know, a fruit seller in Tunisia burning himself to death would cause the Arab Spring? Pulsing people is hard, but again, if I had to prognosticate, I would not rule out some event triggering that angst that might push Netanyahu's hand in one direction or the other.
All right. Well, thank you all for the great questions. And we're going to have to wrap things up now. I hope you will join me in thanking Douglas London and Firas Maksad for participating in this week's session on the escalating tensions in the Middle East. We really appreciate your insight and your willingness to share your morning with us. I wish you all the best, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks to all. Thanks to you.
Bye.